Right, this is the fifth video in the Bible and literature introduction. And we're going to talk in this video about the literary patterns of the Bible, narrative patterns, themes, archetypes, and symbols. And I want to start by asking you, getting you to think a bit, maybe what kind of stories these are. So, for example, a family leaves its community and all they know, they take all their belongings and herds and they head west in search of a better land facing hostile peoples, lack of resources, and uncertainty. What kind of movie is that? What kind of story is that? It's typical Western, yeah. Another one, a group of people realize that a great natural catastrophe is about to happen and no one listens because they are too caught up in living lives of ease. And the team works hard to prepare themselves for it and they are the only ones to survive it. Where have you seen this story? It's the typical ecological apocalypse movie. A woman who is close to power, but in a vulnerable position, hears about a plot to commit terrible things, and she must use her beauty, her intelligence, the right words, and courage carefully in order to foil the plot. Some political intrigue you may have seen a movie about. Maybe here's another one. Two brothers. The older one is responsible, hardworking, keeping the family together. The younger one is a reckless partygoer, and he leaves home with his dad's money in search of a life of fun. The father is heartbroken, but he hopes for reconciliation. What will happen? Have you seen movies like this or read stories like this? Kind of typical family drama. Another one, a young knight uses his courage and his wit to kill a giant who is terrorizing the village. A fairy tale? A child is born whose existence threatens the wicked ruler of the kingdom. He must be hidden from the evil forces, and once grown up, he challenges them. This one you should probably recognize as Harry Potter and many, many other stories. Or the long-awaited chosen one appears in the midst of a desperate situation, facing the powers of evil, dying and coming back to life to rule and set people free from their oppression. The Matrix. So maybe you've recognized them. Maybe they're movies that you've watched. Now, the question is, what do these stories have in common? You've guessed it. They find their source, at least their literary source, in the Bible, directly or indirectly. Leland Bryken says, literature is a great interlocking system in which we are continuously reminded of characters, situations, and symbols that we have encountered in other works of literature. These recurrent units are called archetypes. They fall into three categories: images, such as light, mountaintop, or prison; character types, such as the hero, villain, or tempter; and plot motifs, such as the quest, fall from innocence, or rescue. Archetypes are the basic building blocks of the literary imagination. They recur in literature because they are pervasive in life. And the Bible, as I've mentioned before, is the book of archetype. As we've said, archetype means an original imprint. And Ryken adds in the same kind of book, for Western literature, the Bible is the definitive and most complete repository of archetypes. It's literally the book of archetypes, right? And its own stories have become the inspiration for many, many other stories in the canon of literature. So we've already seen how the Bible provides or follows a grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, with the sacrificial death of Jesus as the turning point that brings about the transformation, leading to a happy ending and new heavens and new earth. But we can also see other narrative elements or other types of plots that are seen throughout the text, such as, we've seen this one, the narrative of a covenant relationship that gets broken, like the stories of Adam and Eve, or the relationship between Israel as a people and God, where there's this joyful relationship, but then there's some action that happens where there's a breaking of faith, breaking of trust between the parties, and one party has to do something to restore the relationship so that it can finally be, bear fruit, right? We also see the idea of pilgrimage, this perpetual search of a place of rest, a place to call home, which is a reflection of the way humans often feel alienated and not at home with themselves, with our family, with our neighbors, right? And we see this in the story of Adam and Eve's banishment and Abraham's pilgrimage, the pilgrimage of the Israelites in the Exodus story in the desert for 40 years, the story of the Jewish exile and their return. and the life of Jesus' disciples, who are basically sent off into the world as missionaries, and they have this idea that they are on mission, but they're not fully at home, even though they're sent out. It's not a punishment, but there is this idea of mission, and we will eventually reach home. And there is also the narrative of the search for a good ruler in the hope of the Messiah King. This is underlined in the Bible by the succession of bad rulers, the chaos that they bring, and the way they're always compared to David and his son Solomon, who both of them ruled well for a time, even if it wasn't perfect. And it's also underlined by the prophets that are regularly talking about the coming Messiah, the son of David, who would bring shalom, which means peace and rest to the people. This idea of, seeking a good king. And then finally, you see many other plot types that are repeated in the Bible, and then they're taken up in works of literature or film. So, for example, you can see here, there's infertility in the promised child, the prophesied child, right? So, story of Abraham and Sarah with Isaac, the story of Samson, who is also this kind of promised child. Hannah and Samuel, Hannah is this woman who's infertile, and she has this child Samuel. Elizabeth and Zechariah, an old couple that have John the Baptist as their son, and then obviously Mary, the Virgin, and Jesus. There's also the conflict between the older and the younger brothers. And this is repeated throughout the book of Genesis. Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. And then there are some stories that are taken up in the New Testament. For example, Jesus's parable of the prodigal son, which we'll look at together. There are moral tests or temptations that are passed and failed. So Adam and Eve, for example, they pass the test. They fail the test. Solomon passes a test at one point, but then he fails later on. And Jesus is the one who consistently passes. And then there's the narrative pattern of the journey or initiation. A character has to grow up through trials and dangers. I mean, you see this in almost every series where there are young people involved. Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, all these characters have to grow up and become, learn how to trust God, learn how to deal with problems. And so you get these kind of, these stories repeated. Then there's the underdog story. So the most famous one being David and Goliath, right? So the story of the knight against the giant. That's David and Goliath. Goliath is this huge giant. David is a young man, and it's impossible to beat him. But he trusts in God, right? And then in other places of the Bible, there's Gideon versus the Midianites, an older David versus King Saul, Elijah versus his enemies, which are the political religious powers of his day. There is the death or the suffering and the resurrection or victory through death, right? So Joseph, Samson, Job, Jonah, Jesus, all these J's, they kind of have to go through some kind of suffering or even sometimes death in order to then, come back on top and rule and win. And then you get tragic antiheroes, and their character flaws lead to downfall, like Saul and Samson and all these judges in the book of Judges. There are lots and lots of characters like that, and that you'll find again in stories outside of the Bible, like Macbeth, for example. Then there's a redeemed antihero whose character flaw leads to great suffering, but is saved through faith and repentance, like Abraham, like Jacob, like David. And then finally, you'll see often the story of the angel of death. The wicked get their comeuppance through a human who comes and judges them, or even a spiritual power that comes and judges them. You see this in the story of Exodus. You see this in the story of Revelation, for example. You also see it in the story of Samson. But in any case, these are stories that are repeated over and over. Okay. So there you go. You see the kind of repeated biblical narrative patterns that then find their way into other literature. So let's talk now about symbols. I mean, you could try and think about where have you seen narratives like that. That would be an interesting exercise, variations on those narratives. So let's talk about symbols. Symbols in the Bible. So the Oxford Concise Dictionary of Literature says a symbol is anything that stands for or represents something else beyond it, usually an idea conventionally associated with it. In literary usage, a symbol is a specially evocative kind of image, a word or phrase referring to a concrete object, scene, or action, which also has some further significance associated with it. Roses, mountains, birds, and voyages. A symbol differs from a metaphor in that its application is left open as an unstated suggestion. Now, what symbols do you think come from the Bible? And what are their significance? There are so many. I want you to maybe take a moment to pause the screen in the next slide and try and think about works of fiction where you see these symbols used. Light, darkness, tree, water, river, sea, well, spring, fruit, as I said, the apple from the Latin malus, or the snake / dragon. You can read the rest of these things, these symbols, but can you think of any of these symbols used in works of fiction? You can pause and take a look. These are common in the Bible, and often they're used in binary opposites, as you can see from this slide. So you get, for example, God and angels are opposed to Satan and demons. There's some kind of tempter or tyrant or traitor, hypocrite, liar, fool, the evil religious leader. All these are types of bad people, and they're opposed with maybe the virtuous wife or the virtuous husband, the virtuous parent, the innocent child, the righteous king, the priest, the shepherd. And you get food, for example, bread, milk, barbecue, like grilled meat, right? Wine and honey. These are symbols of abundance, of joy, of fun, and they're opposed to poison, drunkenness, vinegar, cannibalism. These are things that will come out in pictures in the Bible. There are animals. So, for example, lambs, doves, lions, eagles, songbirds. And they are opposed to monsters or wolves, snakes, and carrion birds. Carrion birds meaning those who basically eat carcasses. And then you get locations as well. So the garden, the mountaintop, the pastoral setting, and the path of the righteous, which is also a place, a symbolic place. And they are opposed to, for example, the dark forest, the wilderness, the desert, right? The cave, the dark valley, and the path of the wicked. There are also more kind of plant-based, kind of agricultural or trees and things like that. So, for example, the vineyard, the oak, the fruitful trees, or the fields, healing plants, things like that. And they are opposed to thorns and thistles, weeds, unfruitful or poisonous plants, right? So agriculture is big in the region where this text comes from. And then you get things like, water in various ways. So river, a spring of water, rain coming down, or baptism, which is to be immersed in water. And they are opposed with the chaotic sea, this dangerous sea with lots of beasts in it, or the Dead Sea, which is this place, an actual physical place in Israel, which is basically dead because there's too much salt in it, so it's not able to produce fruit. And then you have things like dust, ashes, rust, and decay that are opposed to jewels and purifying fire and light, and the rock, a rock of refuge. And so you see that they're very powerful images that instantly evoke emotions, feelings, and pictures, images in our mind. So it's very strong imagery, and often in these kind of opposites, these binaries, right? And so these are symbols. You can find them in so many places. You might want to pause and think, okay, can I think of any stories, any plays, any novels, any movies where I've seen these things mentioned, or these things even physically seen in these stories. So that's for kind of the physical symbols that you'll see in characters and locations and food, for example, and animals even. We can now talk about symbols Oh yes, right. So there's also the opposition of nakedness versus being clothed, for example. Uh, oh yeah, Jerusalem versus Babylon. Yeah, different types of cities as well. Yeah. Okay, now we can look at symbolic names, because names can be used as allusions in stories that add a layer of reading to a text. Names can also have, be found from in the scripture, right? So you'll see names in stories and things like that, and you can look it up and you'll realize, oh, that name comes from the Bible. And that has a symbolic element to it, because naming itself is super important in the Bible. We saw that when we were reading Genesis 3, that Adam names Eve, right? And so from this in literature, we get the idea of characteronyms, right? That the idea that names characterize the people in the stories. A person who gives a name is a person who bestows identity. And in narratives, names matter because they shape the character, as you have seen if you've studied the namesake in year 11. And so it can add layers of readings to a text with maybe emphasis into the character, or irony, maybe if the character is the opposite of what would be expected. So for example, in Moby Dick, there are characters like Ahab and Ishmael, but you get even a character called Phineas in the famous novel A Separate Peace. But all these characters, these names like Joshua, Caleb, Mary, Delilah, Moses, Eli, Ichabod, or even simply Christian as the main character of The Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's novel. These names, they carry a weight because of the story of the character behind them. So the name Mary evokes this sense of piety. The idea of Joshua, Caleb evokes a sense of bravery. Delilah is a name that evokes sensuality and temptation. The name Ichabod, right? So Ichabod Crane in Sleepy Hollow. The name Ichabod actually it comes from the Bible. It means there is no God here. So there is Ichabod already sounds pretty gloomy as a name, but then you realize it means that there is a lack of glory, lack of God's glory in this place. And the story of Sleepy Hollow happens in a place where there's this kind of headless horseman, right? And so the names can be symbolic, but also the names of places can be symbolic. You see this, in Salem, Gilead, Babylon, Bethlehem. There are places in America that have these names, and stories happen there. Or even sometimes there are stories that are written about places. Like, for example, so in Margaret Atwood's story, the Handmaid's Tale, happens in a place called Gilead. Gilead is a place that is just before entering the Promised Land in the books of the Bible, right? Salem, obviously, Salem is the ancient name of Jerusalem, but is where the Salem witch trials happened. So that's the place where the crucible takes place. So it would be interesting to look up for you when you're reading a story and you notice the name has got the place has got this name. Look up if there is any significance to that name. Look up the names of the characters. Look up if there is a meaning to the name, or if there is a story behind the story of your character. There's another character that has a name in the Bible or somewhere else, and you'll see maybe there's irony, maybe there's contrast, maybe there's emphasis. And then there are symbolic numbers. Now this is a bit quicker because there are not that many. Obviously there are plenty of numbers, but these are kind of some of the numbers that really stand out in the Bible, and that will actually find their way into other places. So 3 and the repetition of threes, for example, 4, 7, which is a number of completeness. 4 is a number of kind of creation, because it talks about the 4 corners of the earth. 8 is after 7, so it's the new beginnings. 12 is kind of the number of the tribes of Israel, the number of the 12 apostles. 33 is the kind of the traditional age given to Christ. 40 is one generation in the Bible, so it's the 40 years of wandering, 40 days of temptation of Christ in the desert. Then there is the 70 or 72, which is this kind of the number of the nations in the Old Testament. It's the number of elders of Israel, and there's a number of the disciples that go out. And also it's like 10 times 7, so it's kind of once again, these kind of numbers that symbolize completeness or things like that. You also find, for example, 7 times 7, so that's like 49/50. That's also like a jubilee year in the Bible. The 50th year is the jubilee year, when they're kind of, you release people from debt and release people from slavery and things like that. And then obviously there are these kind of the number 666, which is the number of the beast in Revelation. The number of kind of representing the power of man that exalts itself against the glory of God, and then 1000, which is symbolic for a lot. So maybe you can think of some of these numbers used in works of fiction. You can look them up. Whenever you see a number, though, and you feel like there's something significant there, it's worth looking it up and seeing, does this have any significance either in the Bible or elsewhere? Okay, that's for the symbolic numbers. Now we're going to look at the idea of Christ as a literary type that is repeated in stories. Now, there basically many heroes are based on Christ in some way. Christ heroes can sometimes, it's unintentional from the part of the author, but the Christ hero may share many characteristics with Christ. It doesn't have to share all of them, right? It could be just variations of some of these things, and it could be an anti-hero, it could be an unwilling hero. But basically, if you see a character that is maybe a carpenter around 30, 33, he's an unexpected child or a miracle child, or maybe he hangs around with 12 friends, maybe he walks on water, or he seems to be walking on water. Maybe he's one who feeds other people. Maybe he heals other people. Maybe he has wounds in his hands or his feet or his side, for example. Maybe he's able to puzzle characters with his words. Maybe he suffers unjustly to bring about change. Maybe he's betrayed by a friend. Maybe he comes back to life after a great sacrificial act. These are elements that you'll see in Christ heroes. So you can try and think of any of these used for a character in works of fiction. And we can look at the story of the Old Man and the Sea, written by Ernest Hemingway. Thomas Foster mentions this in his book How to Read Literature Like a Professor, but he's not the first one who's kind of noticed this. In this story, there are symbolic names and symbolic jobs. There are symbolic locations, symbolic numbers, and symbolic occurrences. So symbolic imagery once again. So, for example, the character's name is Santiago, which means Saint James. Manolin means Emmanuel. And their job, well, they're fishermen. The fishermen were apostles. Fishing was the apostles' job. And so James and Emmanuel, these are kind of biblical sounding names. Yes, Emmanuel means God with us. He's the child of promise. It's some kind of in the prophetic texts about Jesus. Santiago, James, this kind of apostolic figure who is also the Christ figure. There is the sea, which is this scary place, this chaotic place. There are sharks, which basically he has to fight against. There is the marlin, which is this amazing, beautiful fish that he has to win, beat, overcome. And then he keeps dreaming about lions. And then there are symbolic numbers. There are 2 sets of 40 that he has to experience, just like Jesus has to kind of basically spend 40 days and nights in the desert, being tempted. And then there is an occurrence that takes 3 days and 3 nights, and so kind of references to the cross, death, resurrection. And then there are symbolic occurrences. The main hero, Santiago, has his hands injured. At the end of the story, he is carrying a beam, like carrying the cross, and he lies down with his arms stretched out like someone who's been crucified. That doesn't tell you why Hemingway decided to write the story with all these elements, but it tells you that he did, and he's maybe saying something. Maybe he's saying something about the life of a fisherman, that it's a difficult life, and that these people deserve respect in the same way that Christ is given respect. Maybe it means something else, but in any case, he's using these different patterns, these motifs, and these names, these symbols from the Bible to tell his story and to give it a certain depth, a certain oomph to it, right? So that kind of gives you the idea of how symbols can be powerful and can be used in literature. In the next video, we're going to be looking at literary references from texts that you've studied maybe to the Bible. Okay.